Everyone, thank you so much for being here with us and for joining. And Catherine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Of course. So I want to start where these often start, which is if you could just tell us very briefly what Impossible Creatures is about in your own words.
Of course. So, Impossible Creatures is about a little cluster of islands right in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, so between me and you, in which all the mythical creatures that mankind has ever invented are still alive. And that means all the creatures we're very familiar with, like dragons and sphinxes and centaurs, but also the creatures that mankind wrote down maybe 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago and have slightly fallen out of common imagination. So that would be things like the almirage, which is a golden hare with a horn, or a ratatosca, which is a little green squirrel-like creature, which in Norse mythology is the messenger from man to gods, but in the archipelago, the enchanted Glimori archipelago, just spreads rumors. So if you wanted to spread a story about someone and you weren't that worried about accuracy, you would tell a little green ratatosca.
I love that. And it's such a big, idea. I'm curious where that first initial inspiration was that sprouted this story.
So it in fact began less with the world, although I have always adored mythical creatures ever since I was small enough to believe they in fact did exist. Um, but mostly with, there are two main characters in the book. One of them is a boy, and it's through his eyes that we see the world. His name is Christopher, and he is from the UK. And the other is a girl called Mal. And she has a coat that allows her to fly, but only when the wind blows. And she is from the archipelago, and that's her home. And I began with her. So she was my very first image. The idea of a girl who had a coat that allowed her to fly. And when the wind is high, she can swoop like up over mountains and over trees, and her feet just skim over the tops of branches. But when the wind drops, of course, she has to be near land. Otherwise, there could be a terrible disaster. And the idea was that I would have these two characters, a boy from our world for whom everything would be new, and a girl for whom it was all familiar and as day to day as pigeons and, giraffes are to us. And the creatures, when we first meet the archipelago, are dying, and nobody quite knows why. And the glimori, which is an old word for a kind of magic, is just starting, we think, to fade out of the earth and out of the air and out of the water. And they have to find why, and then they have to change it.
I love it. So we're gonna get back to the creatures in a second. It's probably gonna be most of what we talk about because it's just so wonderful. But I want to. So it starts with this girl who can fly. You've got the boy who's her counterpart. How do you go like when in this thinking process, building out the story, did the mythical creatures enter into it, and how did you develop that initial kernel of an idea into where it is now?
So I would say the creatures were probably, they were the next thing. So I thought, I have this girl and I need a world large enough to fill for her, large enough for her to spread her wings and fly. And obviously, I knew I wanted it to be wild, and I've always wanted to write fantasy ever since I was very, very small. Fantasy has just been the thing that sort of, there's something when you're a child, there's always something that grabs you more than anything else. And for me, it was Narnia and Tolkien and Diana Wynne Jones and Ursula Le Guin. And I think I then I sold this book. I signed the contract on it with the basic idea the day before my 30th birthday. I am 37. So it has been a long, long journey. And a lot of that journey was in the researching of the mythical creatures, because I have another job. My other job is that I have a fellowship at an Oxford college. I'm a writer of nonfiction, a Renaissance scholar. So I study Shakespeare and John Donne. And what that means in practical terms is that I love a library. I love an archive. I love a manuscript. I love something that someone laid down with pen and ink 500 years ago, and that you can touch and touch the same ink. And it's like the 500 years vanishes because there's you and the paper and them. And so I spend a lot of time reading about these old creatures that we imagined. But then I take them and I give them a twist so that they live in my world.
So let's segue into the fantastical creatures. Obviously, it's called Impossible Creatures, so there are lots of creatures in this book, and I want to get to the research element too. But I'm curious, just from like the bare bones, what was your draw to these creatures? What is it about you that led you to spend so much time getting to know them?
Think it was a lot of things. Like, why do we have mythical creatures? And I think there are sort of two broad reasons. One of them is we used to think they were real. Like, it makes sense to imagine mythical creatures. There's a wonderful historian of ancient history called Adrienne Mayer, and she points out that something like the mythical thunderbird, which you get in the South Americas, makes sense if you imagine a T-Rex arm, the little arm, and then the big shoulder blade. It looks like a wing. It looks like a chicken foot. And so you would think, well, what kind of bird would be big enough for that? And you invent the bird, and that's the thunderbird. So sometimes I think we are just reckoning with the real world, and what we came up with turned out to be fantastical. And of course, also wonderfully, we used to believe that unicorns were real. In the 16th century, a man in the Sinai desert insisted that he saw a unicorn with a horn a foot long. But then I think also sometimes we know we're inventing them. And then what we're doing is we're talking about humanity. We're talking about our fear, our terror of like sailors at sea being sucked down to the bottom of the ocean, a great terror, whirlpools and storms. So we have the kraken. Or sometimes I think we're creating them to warn children as a really great way to hold kids at bay, like sit down and be quiet, or the clud will come and eat your head. And then I think also sometimes they're a way to think about like delight and enchantment and ecstasy. Like, why do we have phoenixes and unicorns and tiny little foxes called cankos, which have two tails and can sit on the palm of your hand? These are a way of thinking about joy and about the actual delight of the living world. And so I think for me, because mythical creatures crush so much that is magnificent of our own heart, of our own history, and of our own desires, I wanted to just people the book with them. And also just, they're really great.
They are. And I'm glad you brought up unicorn. There's so many great stories, but one of my favorite historical stories about unicorns is how Vikings used to sell narwhal horns as unicorn horns just to con people, which I think is just delightful.
Isn't that
But
fantastic? In fact, Queen Elizabeth,
yeah,
I have another book called Vanishing Treasures for adults about real animals, about possible creatures. And one of the things that it's quite a lot of it is about narwhals. Queen Elizabeth was given a narwhal hall encrusted with rubies and emeralds, and she was told that it was a horn of the unicorn of the ocean. And in exchange, she gave the guy a castle.
such a fair trade. So let's talk about the researching element because you put a lot of, I mean, you mentioned that you were at libraries, you were poring over manuscripts. What was the research portion of this like? How long did it go, and when did you know that you'd had enough?
So it was a long process, but because it was a huge pleasure, it didn't feel hugely like work. I would say it was over several years, but it was never the only thing I was doing because I would always be researching my academic work or other books. Um, I would say I'd spend a couple of 100 hours, maybe 200 in libraries, but that goes fast. And the question, how do you know when you have enough notes? And of course, because the archipelago is a number of islands, 34 islands, when you need to know which creature lives on which island. So it took a long time to work out which creatures could live with each other, what kind of landscapes they could live in, what would dragons live like? One of the things the book holds is that in history, dragons live in caves and dank areas, but dragons are cold-blooded. They would like the sun. So my dragons like to live close to the sun. And then the question of when do you start? I think it's when the story has grown so big that your chest will no longer hold it. And at that point, you have to stop researching and turn to the story because the story won't wait.
I love you're answering a lot of the questions I was going to ask before I ask them, so thank you. So while you're researching, were you thinking of the story as well, or were you just solely dedicated to let's find out about these creatures and tell the story after?
Also the story. So the story would sometimes I would come up with a creature, I mean, not invent, but find a creature and think, oh, you are what I've been waiting for. Like there's a creature called the Longmer, which is a scaled horse. And in a lot of the mythical accounts you find 200 or 300 years ago, they're sort of dangerous. They're green and shining and beautiful, like a sort of Pegasus, but scaled like a dragon. But I love the idea of an unpredictable creature that is very fast and very strong. So these creatures in my book pull, there's a senate that travels from island to island as a sort of rule of law, and they pull it through the skies. And when I came across them, because before I was thinking, should I have dragons pull the senate? And then I found the Longmers and I thought, that's who's going to pull my senate.
I love that. And you know, you mentioned sort of getting into which creatures could live together. And one of my favorite aspects of storytelling is when essentially characters start writing themselves. I wonder if the characters or if the creatures ever did that for you, where you learn so much about them that you're like, oh, this is where they're going to fit. Did they sort of fill their own role in the story, or were you still casting them about, seeing where they fit best?
I think by the end, you have found so much about them that they do start to just make sense in one space and not make sense in another. And so you can sort of follow their lead. I do also, though, take a lot of liberties with history. So if you were to turn to those wonderful bestiary of the illustrated creatures at the end of the book by Virginia Allen, who was a wonderful artist, some of you get the descriptions of these creatures, and sometimes if you were to then look up the creature in the mythology, you'd be like, I don't know if that's completely accurate, because sometimes I am taking it and giving it a little bit of a twist in the way that like Ratatoska in Norse mythology carries messages to the gods. I have no ancient gods in my story, and so I'm taking these things and giving them little pushes and prods in the direction I want them to go.
So I'm curious, just from hearing that, like you know, you're somebody you're very scholarly, you've come from this background. Like, do you have trouble meddling with history more or less, or like taking
Oh,
liberties like that?
not at all, not for a second.
I love
Not
that.
really. I mean, the one thing I was very aware of was that some of these creatures come from cultures that aren't my own. Many of them come from Northern Europe. My family is mostly English and French, but of course some of them are from Japanese or Northern African mythology, and those are the ones where I would be more careful. And especially, I have this great stroke of luck that I belong to a university, so I could speak to people from those cultures who are themselves historians of those cultures and make sure that I wasn't in wanting to take these creatures and twist them a little, in any way changing them in ways that would go against what they were invented for in the first place.
Mm. And then, you know, you mentioned how there are some creatures who are not as well known, and then some like unicorns and dragons that we've all heard of. Was it more challenging to write the ones that people perhaps didn't know as well, or were those more of an opportunity to more or less educate people in what they were?
I think writing about the ones that are largely unknown were perhaps the most fun, because I knew that very few children will have heard of the Karkadan, which is a kind of purplish black unicorn that you find mostly in southern Europe, sometimes in bits of the Middle East, a little bit in what was Persia, Iran. And those are like unicorns in that they have a horn, but their horn is poison, and they have yellow teeth and yellow feet, and they would eat you for fun. And writing about them was just a huge pleasure.
I can imagine. I want to ask specifically about the Griffin, because the Griffin plays a big role in the story. It's Mal's companion, just an adorable character to have in the story. Why a Griffin? And were there other creatures in the running to be that sort of right-hand companion?
It was always going to be a griffin. Griffins for me are one of the most beautiful mythical creatures. They were always said to be one of the wisest. They are part lion, part eagle. They have the glory of those two creatures, two of my favorite real life animals. And I wanted the idea of something that has in it familiarity. We all know what griffins are, more or less. We have loved them for a long time. But a small one would also have vulnerability, because a baby bird and a baby lion, they are they are excitable and wild, but they need your help. And I wanted the griffin to be a creature who is in need of protection. And that is quite a crucial part of the story, that Mal has this little baby griffin. She rescued the egg and she's been raising him, and he is the thing perhaps that she loves most.
So before we move on from fantastical creatures, I have to ask if you have a favorite and a least favorite fantastical beast.
I think my favorite, absolute favorite, apart from Gelifen the Griffin, is this little dragon called the Jaculus dragon. In my book, he is small enough to sit on the top joint of your thumb. And he is found in Pliny, who wrote in 77 AD the Natural Histories, which is often said to be the first encyclopedia. And Pliny writes about a tiny tree dragon called the Jaculus, which will fire itself at your head from the tree like it's sprung from an engine. And Pliny was writing real history. You know, he was writing about hedgehogs and fish. And I just love that in among that, there's this dragon. And I loved writing a tiny dragon who has huge fire, but also he's been left alone for a long time on an island, guarding, I won't say what, but something magnificent. And I loved the idea that he might have the personality of like a really irate, furious academic who is also a little bit drunk. That was the look I was going.
That's wonderful. And do you have a least favorite creature? I hate to put that like we want to stay positive, but is there one that you're just like, oh, I don't like him?
I mean, one of the things you find when you start reading a lot about creatures is for every creature who is a creature said to bring luck or light or just pure delight, there are 10 who will bite your arm off just for fun. And I think my least favorite, just in terms of ones I wouldn't want to meet, would be a kraken, because they're slimy and murderous and enormous and like not good to chat to. You know, they don't have much of a personality down there in the deep depths, just essentially a huge squid with rage.
That's great. So, as much as I don't want to, let's move on from fantastical creatures. But I do want to talk about the world of this story because the world is wonderful, and I want to show actually the illustration of it at the front because there's a beautiful map.
Uh,
Let's see if we can
Again,
see
by
that.
Virginia Allen, just absolutely wonderful.
It's just gorgeous. So I want to ask, I mean, just starting off pretty basic or general of what went into building this world and why did it take the shape that it did as a cluster of islands?
So the building took a long time, many, many false starts. I wouldn't say that the archipelago sprung fully formed in the way that the creatures and Mal and Christopher did. Deciding where the islands were and exactly what they held took a long time. And in fact, it was both a huge pleasure working it out, but also a lot of starting and stopping. And so I'm thrilled that you showed that map because just before we started this interview, I ran to try to find my early draft of the map. And I couldn't find the draft that looks closest to that one, the sanest one. But I could find the very, very, very first one, which looks like this. It looks insane. It makes sense only to me. And huge numbers of these islands move around over the next 3 years in which I am making them make sense. And the thing is, I know far more about them than is helpful. I know it, but you never need to know it. The children who will read this book never need to know it because then it would become like a sort of encyclopedia of the archipelago. I just wanted to know it so that it would be real to me. Because I think if it's real to me, if I know what the world is like per island, who rules, some of them only have creatures, some of them have humans and creatures coexisting, then when I write it, even if I'm not telling you, I hope it will feel that little bit more like its feet are on solid, deep earth. That's the hope. Um, and and I think there's also real pleasure in the act of invention. So for me, the fact that I know exactly what is happening on the island of Dusha, maybe we'll never even go to the island of Dusha, but I know what's there.
You preemptively answered my follow-up question, which was, do you know what creatures are on each island? And you know the habitat, you know the ecosystem of each island, even if, like you said, they might not make it into the story. So that does help you as you tell the story, just knowing that wherever they go, you know what's there. Yes.
Exactly that. I know that I can take them, and of course, possibly by the time I'm a couple, I'm finishing book 2 at the moment. Um, it might be that I'll have to tweak bits for the story. and that's absolutely grand. But the thing I wanted was to be sure that it would have reality. So, for instance, languages have been something I think about a lot. All of the islands, all of their names are variations on ancient languages. So, because the archipelago set off from us 3,000 years ago, but people have been traveling back and forth who know the secret ways since then. So, we've never been totally cut off from them. But it would mean that the languages that the islands are named in would be ancient languages. So, it's Old English, Old Arabic, Old Chinese, the oldest of French, Aramaic, Sanskrit, the languages which have been around for a very long time. And then the questions of what languages they would speak on the islands. They all speak the local languages, which sometimes, there's Sphinx is a language, dragon is a language. So some will speak those, some will speak English. But most people are polyglot because I thought if you're inventing a series of islands, why not make people multilingual? Because I live on my own island in Britain where we are famous for not speaking other languages.
And that's fascinating. I was thinking in terms of like creatures and ecosystems and how they live together. I hadn't even thought about languages and how you would differentiate them. So that's just fascinating to hear. Like, did you run into any challenges when crafting these islands of like, where do I put this creature? Where could they live? Where could the people coexist with them? Were there any challenges along the way that were more difficult than others?
There always are the ideas. So you don't want to, the thing I didn't want to do was stuff it so full of mythical creatures that it felt like you couldn't move for a kind of forest of them. So sometimes I would take things out so it didn't feel too crowded with new creatures in a way that got in the place of story. Because for me, the creatures are a great joy, but the story will always be the thing that matters most. And then the other thing was, so for instance, the Nereids, which are like mermaids but with legs, and famously in all the stories you find a little bit wilder, a little bit more dangerous. I didn't think they would speak English. They do speak English as their, eighth language, but what would Nerish be? And writing a language is a really joyful and quite complicated thing. Mine is based very, very, very loosely on sort of Old English, what you might call Anglo-Saxon English, but only in sort of subjunctive and gerund forms, on the grounds that, they'd love a subjunctive down in the ocean.
I'm curious why you felt it was important to have this story couched in the real world. So yes, they're in this fantastical archipelago, but it's also set in the real world. Like we start off in Scotland with Christopher. Why was it so important for that to be the case as opposed to going full on high fantasy, brand new world, all that stuff?
Because I wanted to be able to go there. Because I wanted it to be a place where it's conceivable. I can't go to the Shire and meet the hobbits, but I can go to Narnia and I can go to Neverland, and I can go to Hogwarts. I wanted the idea that there would be the possibility that we could reach it. And I wanted children to live in that possibility. And one of the things that has been the biggest joy of my working life, it's been out in the UK for nearly a year now. And so I often go and I meet kids, in crowds and a couple of the kids over the last year, just a few have come up to me and said, I'm 12. I'm not an idiot. I know it's not real. Obviously, it's not real. I'm not dumb. Just to check, is it real? And that bit, that just in case, that tiny, tiny possibility, that's why I wanted it to be through our real world and into theirs.
I love that. That's like the best answer I could have ever imagined. And that must feel so good for kids to be like, this could be real, right? Like
It's
that's
a tiny, tiny possibility. I'm thrilled.
so I want to ask about, this mentioned this has been out in England for quite a while, for a year. It is coming. I forget the exact release date in America. I know it's like just right around the corner. Um,
Doubt.
oh, it is. Okay, perfect. So go get it. But there's also a sequel coming. And I'm curious, like, I mean, this book has made quite a splash. It's all over the place. People are loving it. Is there like an added pressure writing the sequel to make sure it lives up to the first one, or what have the challenges been for writing a follow-up to this? And was that always going to be the case? There was always going to be a sequel or a trilogy, or was that always the plan?
It was always going to be a series. I always knew that that there were stories that I wanted to tell that I could not tell in that one book. And writing the second one, yes, I think there was real pressure, but it's the very specific pressure of child readers. And I think it's a good pressure because I feel like the pressure is, I worry less about reviews and more about the idea that if a child has loved book one, you have to give them both the same, as in the same texture of world, the same rules of reality, the same bid for a world big enough that they can walk into it and feel like they stand upright and breathing in it, but also newness. I don't want to do exactly the same again. So new stories, new plots, new ideas. You know, I think one of the things I love about fantasy is it's never really just about the story. The story is always, in the best fantasy, about something big. You know, fantasy is in many ways like philosophy's more gorgeously painted brother. You know, it's a way of asking questions. And Impossible Creatures, I loved writing it, and I wanted it to be a big adventure that would just be fun and funny and full of good food and wild jokes. But I also wanted it to be about questions, about like, what will you do for love? What will you do when the world calls you? Will you come? What would it be like to know a great deal about humankind? What would you say of us if you could see the full sweep of us? What would you judge us to be? These questions, it seems to me that these are questions kids can absolutely rise to, as long as you also give them good jokes and good food and, you know, a few really great battles.
Mm. I love that. And you know, you mentioned one of my favorite aspects of this story is that nugget that kids can make a difference. And that's sort of like one of my big takeaways from this story was like they were the only ones who could save this world. How actively are you engaging with themes as you tell the story, or are you just telling the story and those themes just happen to be there along for the ride?
I think I always knew right back at the beginning that I wanted the story to be about the idea of what is it that we can do? What is it that we owe the world? What will our courage look like? How much courage will be demanded of us? I wanted it to be the idea that you are capable of a great deal. You are capable of perhaps so much more, especially if you are a child, than you are given credit for. And I wanted just to say that very loudly to children. You know, you have the capacity for such remarkable things. I don't mean that we should leave saving the world to children. I think we should be getting on with that as adults. But I do think that we underestimate children over and over again. I think we underestimate the clarity of their sense of justice. And I think we underestimate the reality of their love. And I wanted a book that would salute their understanding as being large and bold and worth hearing.
I want to get to another book that you have, a smaller book, Why You Should Read Children's Books, even though you're it's a long title, I'm sorry. Why You Should Read Children's Books, even though you're a wise old adult. Because this has essentially become like my Bible. I'm an adult who reads almost exclusively children's books. I'm curious from your point of view, and you know, again, if you haven't read this, it's a very short book. You can read it very quickly, and it's so worth it. Why you felt like this needed to be said, why you needed to tell adults it's okay to read children's books. Not just it's okay, but you should.
I think it was partly children's books can do something that even the very finest adults books cannot. I love adult fiction. Most of my time is spent reading Renaissance literature, which doesn't tend to skew kiddie. But there is a strangeness and an exuberance in children's fiction. There is an embracing of the imagination. And to go back to children's fiction as an adult can be a way to remember what it was to live in the space of huge imagination. Because I think sometimes in adulthood, as part of our compromise, as part of our growing up, and part of our bid to shape in the shape of the world, we forget that the imagination is not something you can safely discard. It is not some optional extra. It is the condition precedent for political change. You have to be able to imagine a different world. instead of just a bleak continuation of this one. And you have to be able to imagine another human soul in order to love. And I wanted the idea that children's fiction can be a way to kind of like those shock pads that you defibrillate someone back into life, to like defibrillate your imagination back into full being. And also the other reason was I have two jobs, and if I tell someone I'm a fellow of an Oxford college, they treat me very differently than if I say I write children's fiction and I was sick of it.
I love that. I love the defibrillating someone's imagination. I'm gonna borrow that and use it for people because I think that's a wonderful way to put it. That's very interesting. You mentioned Renaissance literature. Where do you like? Because writing for children, it's often it's a challenge. You have to meet that voice that's right for them. Does that writing voice come naturally to you? Because when I think, like you mentioned, Renaissance literature does not read for kids. So where do you get that voice from that writes for kids?
So it comes, that's my voice. That's the voice in my head. But I think literature does help, the Renaissance literature, because my source of my academic speciality is John Donne, and he wrote satire and love poetry. He wrote deeply, deeply strange semi-epic verse, and he broke all the rules that language at the time was held to come with. So, there was a sense of propriety with poetry and of a set of regulations that you should not collapse. And he did. He just essentially sort of put a mine in the middle and blew them up. He didn't care about these laws. And I think that having love done from a very young age really helped me with the idea that you don't have to write in everyone else's voice, only in your own. Language is not a set of rules, it's a set of huge possibilities. And so I think that really helped when I came to write for children. I wanted the idea that you can go quite ambitious in your writing for kids. You can have complicated words, and if they don't understand them, it doesn't matter at all. They don't need to be scholarly kids. They can just hop over the word they don't know and run on through the story. But then maybe they'll pick up a few of those words on the way, and that will toughen their vocabulary and help them express their complex thoughts when the time comes.
And then before we wrap up here, I want to ask about another book that's coming soon from you, which is Vanishing Creatures, which is, I think you mentioned it earlier, nonfiction about creatures in our real world that are unfortunately disappearing. Curious, like it sounds like a natural segue. You go from impossible creatures, these fantastical creatures that are gone. Now you're writing nonfiction, which you write nonfiction all the time, but nonfiction specifically about those real creatures around us that are disappearing. Was that a natural segue to go from impossible creatures to these creatures around us that are disappearing as well?
So yes, it was. They are sort of in some ways interconnected. So it's called Vanishing Treasures, a bestiary of extraordinary endangered animals. And it's a series of 22 essays about real animals. So narwhals and giraffes and wombats. I think the opening one is a raccoon, partly about the raccoon who went to live at the White House during the Coleridge administration, wore a little bow tie, bit the president. But also creatures that you wouldn't think of as endangered, like crows or spiders or hedgehogs, where it's not that they are endangered, but there is a species or subspecies that is endangered. And I just wanted to take a chance to talk to people about how remarkable is the living world and how we still know so little about it. That, our wonder and our knowledge is huge, colossal, and our wonder is even huger. And the reality is so vast that we don't even begin to touch the edges of the truth. And there are all of these creatures that we risk losing before we understand them. We risk losing through our own stupidity, our cruel and money-driven encroachments on the natural world. So it's a sort of plea for your iron-willed astonishment and your political action. That's, I would say, what Vanishing Treasures is.
Love it. All right, so we're just about out of time, but I wanna sort of bring back an old question to end on, which is, through the research process, being a student of history myself, there's a certain like elation when you're researching something and you realize, oh, this is something wonderful. So I want to know, while you were researching impossible creatures, all these, fictional beasts that were once thought to be real, were there any moments, maybe one in particular, where you stumbled on a beast maybe you hadn't heard of, or something interesting about one that you thought you knew everything about? Any moment like that that was just like an aha light bulb over the head moment?
Ah, there were so many, and they were, you get one every couple of months, and those were the days where you felt you could just, cut off work now because that was enough to fill the entire day. I would say one of the things I adored was these ideas of tiny, tiny, these little foxes, these little cancos. I mentioned they have two tails, and they were said to have saliva that had luminescent properties. The idea that if they licked a bit of a paintbrush, you could perhaps use it to paint with. And I loved the idea of something that when we invented it, we thought, how could we make it more lovely? And we said, what if it were to shine? And I just adored that.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's such a great note to end on. So, Catherine, again, thank you so much for being here. For anyone who hasn't picked it up yet, Impossible Creatures is out now. It's on every bookshelf out there. Go get one. And again, Catherine, thank you so much for being here today. Really
Thank,
appreciate it.
thank you so much for your time.